Lloyd coming at you. I'm doing something slightly different this time. I'm going to look at my own shelves and pick a selection of books and talk briefly about each of them. I'm going to start with this top shelf. The Tridane Chronicles by Lloyd Alexander. I think I first read these in junior high and maybe in high school. I can't remember. It's a series of fantasy novels, and they're all collected in one fat volume here. Basically based on Welsh mythology, and the main character is named Heron. He's an orphan apparently, and adapted or taken into the household of Dalbin, who's a wizard, and ends up fighting the main baddie, who, let's see, his name is the Horned King. And the land that they live in is called Tridane. And it's, as a kid, it was very moving. And rereading it as an adult, it's still moving. It's not quite up to Lord of the Rings level, but the story seems nicer than Lord of the Rings. Let's see. Martin Amis's The Alterations. It's it's kind of a science fiction book, an alternate history book, one in which the Catholic Church, there's never a Protestant Reformation, and the Catholic Church essentially rules the entire world. And the main character is a boy who is trying to avoid getting castrated because castrati are valued singers. But mostly what's interesting about this book is how it describes what the world, in Martin Amis's, Kingsley Amis's view. I said Martin before. It's Kingsley Amis. It's Martin's dad. What a Catholic run dictatorship across Europe and really across the world would be like. Here's another one from junior high days, the Foundation Trilogy by Isaac Asimov. And it's 3 books about essentially there's a galactic empire, and there's only humans in our galaxy, so no aliens, but there is faster than light travel, and a mathematician predicts that the empire will fall because he's come up with a new form of math and slash sociology slash economics that runs all the possibilities through equations and does forecasts. And to me that was a very fascinating thing, and it made me very interested in forecasting in general and economics and sociology and so on. And the first book pretty much shows how he's getting it right as time progresses. He and his followers end up forming a colony on the edge of the galaxy, far from the center, where the empire is ruled from. And as generations pass on this colony, they gradually become more and more powerful. But in the second book, their entire plan, the Selden plan, as it's called, falls apart because there's a character named the Mule who has psychic powers, which can't be predicted by Selden's equations. And so, they don't know really how to deal with it, but it turns out that there's a second foundation that was secretly formed in Trantor, the capital of the empire, where they've really progressed much more than the first foundation in terms of mental ability, and they're able to to take care of the mule, and finally they end up defeating the mule, and that continues into the second book, our third book, Foundation Empire. And anyway, it's a great science fiction book. If you read it, you'll find it like almost every science fiction book written back then. You'll find it kind of condescending towards women in general, and but there is a female heroine in the third book, Arcady. Next, I have a bunch of books by Donald Barthelme, including a really good biography of him by Tracy Daugherty called Hiding Man. And Barthelme was a fiction writer who came from Houston. His father was an architect here, and he grew up here, went to the University of Houston, and briefly he published a magazine while he was at University of Houston, which I would love to get my hands on. And he briefly ran the Contemporary Arts Museum, which wasn't the building now that's on Bissonnette at the corner of Montrose, but it was just a society that put on exhibitions. And then he got kind of hired by Harold Rosenberg, the famous art critic in New York, to help him put together a magazine in New York, moved to New York and became the writer that we know, the pioneer of postmodernism that we know. And of his books of fiction that I have, my favorite book is this one, 40 Stories. Stories are so good, but they are so unusual, and they're so. I think a lot of people found them to be kind of mind benders when they came out. But he was adapted by the New Yorker, so he got his stories published in the best place you could possibly get your stories published in the United States. Then I have a couple books by Rick Bass. They're not the only Rick Bass books I've read. And the first one I got was this one, Oil Notes. I think I read a short story of his in the Paris Review. And and when I say I read, I mean like 30 years ago I read. And this novel is kind of a roman à clef. Bass was a scout for oil drillers in Mississippi, and basically it's about him going around and basically finding rural Mississippi, but trying to find oil. Next, I have several books by Jorge Luis Borges, who's someone I first read in when I was in college. And basically, I was going to go work on a boat. This was my dad's company, Western Geophysical, and he basically made it possible for his sons and nephews and so on, his extended family, to get summer jobs on their exploration boats. And Western Geophysical was an oil exploration company. Now it's been through many mergers, and now it's completely owned by Schlumberger. And so I packed some books to bring with me, and I didn't know what to bring, so I thought, okay, well, I'll bring books that have to do with the sea, and books that are exotic. And I knew Jorge Luis Borges' name. I didn't really know who he was, so I packed up a book by Borges, and a book by V.S. Naipaul, who also became one of my favorite writers. And Mutiny on the Bounty, which is a rip-snorting yarn, and Moby Dick, which I ended up loving. I mean, I couldn't believe how lucky I was, in retrospect. The books I packed all influenced my later reading tremendously. Anyway, the book I would recommend the most is Collected Fictions. It's all his short stories, and really, he was a short story writer. He and Barthelme are similar in that way. They would occasionally approach the novel, but really, at heart, they're short story writers. And his stories are, he comes out of a modernist world, and he was a disciple of Kafka in his early days, but he's really the first really big postmodern writer, and his stories are gem-like little paradoxes. I love them. I've read them so many times. Okay, the next author we're going to look at is William Boyd, which my name is Robert William Boyd, so it's not me. He's a English writer, or Scottish, I guess I should say. He was the reason I knew who he was. I mean, I knew that there was a writer named William Boyd because I go to Brazos Bookstore, which is a local bookstore here in Houston, and which still exists amazingly. And it's a really high-quality bookstore. And I noticed that there were these books by William Boyd, and I always thought, well, that's interesting. I should see what it's like. But I didn't want to spend the money on a book by an author just because he happened to share most of my name. So then later I moved to Seattle to work for Fantagraphics Books, and I was sort of browsing in a used bookstore, and at that time Seattle was a mecca for used bookstores. And I saw a William Boyd book in the used section. It was a collection of two teleplays he had done, and it was like $1, you know. So I said, for $1 I'll try it out, and it turned out to be really good. And he's become one of my favorite writers since. Although I don't think his latest stuff is that great, but it's always readable. Anyway, this book, The New Confessions, is about a filmmaker named John James Todd, who basically was born before World War I and is old enough to fight in World War I. But in World War I, he becomes a documentary filmmaker for the government, and turns out he's got a real knack for it. And so the subsequent book is basically him being a filmmaker, and he's like a combination of all the great filmmakers. It gave William Boyd an opportunity to fictionalize the lives of Luis Buñuel and so on into this one English filmmaker who ends up in Hollywood, ends up being chased by McCarthyite powers because he had in the 20s he had been in Germany and fallen for communists and made movies with communists and so on, and then had to flee the country, made movies down in Mexico, so that's sort of the Buñuel bit, and then ended up living in an island off of Spain, hoarding the negatives of his lost masterpiece, and finally someone's sort of trying to find out who he is all through the book. So you get present day scenes and then memories of past of his life, and he's paranoid that it's some old McCarthyite foe who wants to finally get revenge on him for something. But it turns out he's being sought out because someone believes that he might have these negatives of this lost masterpiece. So as a film buff and a lover of art, this is a really incredibly entertaining and delightful book. Okay, let's go to Billy Lee Brammer. First, I got another biography of Billy Lee Brammer, also by Tracy Daugherty, who seems to have specialized in Texas writers. And Billy Lee Brammer is kind of interesting because he only wrote one novel and kind of burned out, became like a hippie in Austin after he finished it. But he had been he had worked in the office of Senator Lyndon Johnson, and while he was working in the office, he was writing this book where essentially Johnson as a character, although Johnson is made the governor of Texas, which Johnson never was, and given the name Arthur Fenstermaker, and his 3 novellas, and they are all really good. They give a flavor of what Austin was like in the early '60s. This sort of, well, then and now, a little island of liberalism surrounded by a bunch of cowboys. And anyway, so it's a great book and an American classic. And Billy Lee Brammer, this was his promise that he never delivered on, alas. Anyway, that's not every book on the top shelf, but it's a lot of them, and so that's it. I hope you liked it.